Shmai Jimmy, lluniawn.
Smai, dwi'n iawn, sut wyt ti?
Da iawn, diolch. Ti?
Dal i fynd.
Awesome. We'll switch to English now because that was the most Welsh that I know.
That is, I think, the most Welsh that I've used in a not one of my YouTube videos ever.
So maybe if you can just tell everyone who you are, and you're going to be presenting 500 years of Welsh fashion today, which is exciting. It's one that's near and dear to my heart as well. So who are you and what do you do?
Cool. Sorry, I made a face. I forgot that this had coffee in it yesterday, and now I have coffee tea, so that's exciting. So I'm Jimmy, and I have a YouTube channel called The Welsh Viking, and I am by training an archaeologist, and I do videos on fashion history and general history and archaeology and all that sort of good stuff. Usually focusing on the medieval period, but I am Welsh, I am Cymraeg, and I am from Gogledd Cymru. I'm from North Wales. I guess I was the cheapest option available to talk about Welsh clothes, so
You were also the best option available, so it's really lovely to have you here. I really love your channel, of course, and everything you talk about with regards to Viking history and Welsh history. You had mentioned that there's not really a lot going on with Welsh fashion until the 1800s. So what is going on in the 1400s, and why is there such a lack of information?
the problem for Wales in the 1400s really is at that point it's been annexed by the Norman English, the Anglo-Normans, for effectively 150 years at that point. And there was an element of ethnic cleansing involved. There was an element of sort of cultural genocide, if you like, involved in the annexation and in the conquest. And Wales moves from a very different socio-political model, which was kind of unique to Wales, didn't really use much money, had a fairly complex system of free and unfree subjects that was different to the general feudal model, to basically just using the classic French medieval feudal system model. It then has French-speaking nobles in charge. The native Welsh nobles basically have an ally with us or die option. A lot of the material culture in this period is dictated by the fashions of the elite. So your nobleman's fashions trickle down and are done in a cheaper version or are handed down physically to lower status members of society. So although that is a part of Welsh tradition anyway, now it is, oh, okay, well, these French fashions are now coming down instead of these sort of native Welsh fashions, whatever they may have been. So basically what you see in 1400s is kind of Western European fashion, French fashion, effectively. What you're seeing in France, what you're seeing in England, what you're seeing in lowland Scotland is basically what you're seeing in Wales, as far as we can tell. The problem is, from an archaeological perspective, we got virtually nothing in terms of textile finds for medieval Welsh fashion. Our soil is very difficult to work with sometimes. It's not particularly good for preservation of organics a lot of the time. If it happens to be in a completely deoxygenated area, we might get some stuff, but one of the only fragments that we've got of decent medieval textile is from a crannog in southeast Wales. The only crannog that we found in Wales, and that was from a burnt site that was deep enough under the water and in specific enough pH that we've got this 1,000-year-old piece of linen, and that's basically it. But we find accessories that echo Franco-Anglo, whatever you want to call it, fashion. So we have sort of decorative mounts and ouches and purse fittings of the same size and shape that we would expect to see in England and in France. There's no specific mention that I'm aware of in the 1400s and the 15th century of Welsh people wearing Welsh fashion. Like, I'm not aware of anybody saying, oh, these Welsh are dressing strangely in their crazy Welsh clothes. So as far as we can tell, people are just kind of just dressing in European fashion. And it is the century where the Welsh take over the English, because it's the century where the Tudors become the monarchs at the end of the century. But at that point, the Tudor dynasty is very much a northwestern European royal and noble family, so they're basically following Parisian fashion all the way. But at least it's not English fashion, at least it's French fashion.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So it's like it's just not even really defined definitively Welsh fashion because it's not folk fashion really in that
I
sense.
think at that point the concept of folk dress isn't necessarily a thing in Wales in terms of cultural expression. I think at that point the cultural expression is still, as it mostly is today, still intangible through the poetic tradition and through the storytelling tradition. We do have 15th and 16th century mentions of the Welsh language being important and unique. Things like the celebration of St. David's Day and that kind of stuff. So all of that kind of the aspect of culture is there, but the material culture doesn't seem to get a look in. So as far as we can tell, we've got ladies wearing, oh, in the 1400s, they're wearing the classic dress. Men are wearing tight hose, big pointy shoes, large hats, and doublets that I cannot make. So there doesn't seem to be a great deal of cultural expression through clothing at that point, as far as we can tell, anyway, which is a bit of a shame, but
So then moving into the 1500s, are things now changing? Is there starting to become some shifts in fashion, or are Welsh people still wearing French fashions?
16th century fashion is kind of more of the same, at least in Great Britain. This is very much the kind of Reformation century in England and Wales, at least. In Scotland, obviously, the dates are quite different. Henry VIII, in his Act of Union, basically creates the Kingdom of England and Wales. So at this point, England ceases to exist, Wales ceases to exist administratively, and it becomes England and Wales with a variety of cultural repression. So the use of traditional Welsh patronymic names is banned. Welsh speaking is banned in courts of law and that sort of thing, which is obviously hugely impactful on the culture for centuries to come. As a result of that, if anything, it seems like Wales has even less expression in terms of its material culture, and it basically becomes English cultural expression through material culture. Like, you can't definitively see a difference between the two. Like, it doesn't suddenly, everybody isn't suddenly like, oh, blimey, governor, chimney sweeps. But you can't differentiate between English clothes and Welsh clothes as far as we can tell, except possibly that Welsh clothes might be slightly poorer because Wales is a slightly poorer area. This is also the century where we get our first printed Welsh Bible, which is printed before the first printed English Bible. If anything, intangibly, Welsh culture becomes stronger because more people are reading Welsh. Education and literacy in Wales is higher than in England by the end of the 1500s, which is impressive. This is also a sort of a century of huge tumult and huge political change. You start seeing the very slight emergence of things like the middle class just at the end of the century starting to become a concept. But yeah, in terms of the clothes, they're wearing bodies and ruffs and caps and jackets and those weird Tudor shoes that are square at the front and I think look awful. And men are wearing hose and stockings and peascod doublets and sugarloaf hats and a single earring. In men's fashion, 16th century, it is the gayest century, and I'm down for it. Like, bring back stockings and garters and high heels and like effectively drag by our standards today. I think it's wonderful, but yeah, it's not a time where we can see specific Welsh fashion as far as I can tell. But yeah, we're getting there. We're getting closer.
I'm guessing that the 16 and 1700s are very similar, or is there a shift now?
So, have you got anyone doing Scottish fashion?
It's already been done.
Amazing. Okay, cool. So you've already talked about how in the 1600s you've got things like the kind of lowland, highland. You get depictions of that, and you get depictions of men wearing the plait, and you get like the Scots bonnet and that kind of stuff emerging. Yeah, none of that in Wales, but obviously in Shakespeare we have mentions of people wearing leeks in their caps for St. David's Day, and we think people were actually doing that. So we do have this distinct cultural expression through fashion, albeit a very small, like wearing a leek, probably actually wearing a leaf from a leek in your cap. We know that Welsh people are doing that. We know that they're doing that in England. We know that they're doing that in London. That is a thing that the Welsh community does wherever they are, and we still do that. Like, I wear a daffodil every Dydd Gwyl Dewi on out the cyntaf, and So we know that Welsh people are still seen as distinct culturally. We've got interesting books for continental merchants, for example, where we've got an English phrase book and then a Welsh phrase book. So we like people are learning Welsh to come to Wales and stuff. The end of the 1600s is where we get people like Llwyd, Mr. Dr. Llwyd, goes around the islands and highlands of Scotland and looks into cultural continuity between the Highlands and Ireland and Wales. People start remarking on things like, what are the Welsh wearing? What are the Welsh doing? How are they dressing? And this is kind of the century where the Welsh as being poorer starts to become something that's mentioned, like Wales being a poor part of Great Britain starts to become more of a thing. But yeah, the 1700s is kind of when you start seeing people remarking on Welsh dress as though it's a curiosity. Like people start talking about it because this is the century where they start mentioning flannel, and flannel is a classic English mispronunciation of llanelli. So the idea behind it that I've read is that flannel was a type of woolen cloth produced in and around Llanelli. The S is often rendered as an FL in anglicised spellings, so Llanes, flannel, kind of makes sense. A lot of what you see in the 18th century, especially towards the end of the century, like sort of 1750s onwards, you see people kind of doing miniature grand tours of Wales and talking about the costume, the way that mountain guides dressed, comparing that to the way that people dress in the towns and the countryside. A lot of the descriptions show women going barefoot, sort of lower status, working class women, especially, perfectly happily, perfectly comfortably, apparently. We have lots of mentions of people wearing blue flannel suits, so men wearing blue flannel coats and breeches. Not as much of the kind of lower class people wearing trousers as you sometimes see in coastal areas in other countries, but it seems like fashion by and large is standard Western Europe. So gowns and bedgowns and kerchiefs and that sort of thing for women, and breeches, coats and shirts and waistcoats for the men. But lots of mentions of blue, lots of people wearing red or white or red and white striped stockings and hose, which is fun. So like fairly colourful in its own little way. And the end of the 18th century, so the end of the 1700s, is where you start seeing people drawing the hat. The classic Welsh lady hat, kind of in its infant form, starts appearing, which is fun. And it does seem at the end of the 1700s to just be a topper, like an end of the 18th century style top hat. But it's there. It's finally there. We've got Welsh clothes. For my money, the classic Welsh men's costume nowadays is sort of a 19th century style waistcoat, flat cap and breeches that's kind of very, very fanciful. I would prefer it if we went a bit further back and went for blue flannel breeches and coat and stockings as kind of an expression, because it would fit better with the Welsh lady costume, which kind of is a thing now. We've reached it. Yay.
The Welsh lady costume is a really interesting phenomena even now in the UK. You see depictions of it, especially in mid-century trinkets a lot. Like if you're going antiquing around the UK, especially close to the borders of Wales, you always find these sort of 1950s, 1960s trinkets with the Welsh lady depiction on them. I have like a shoehorn that has a Welsh lady on it, and there's bells with Welsh ladies on it. Do you want to maybe go into the 1800s? And now I'm guessing the Welsh lady costume is going to start actually appearing in its like more complete form. Why is the Welsh lady costume such a big deal in the UK?
Because it's mental looking.
It's a really cool costume.
It's such a cool costume, right? It's genuine folk dress, right? Like it is identifiably working class costume for an 18th or probably early to mid 19th century woman, right? There's a bedgown, there's a gown, bodice, corset underneath, a full gear kerchief, mantle, shawl, mob cap with a cap over the top. It's the whole shebang. Like it's a genuine historical wardrobe. It's interesting that it's so now identifiably a Welsh national costume in the way that tartan or a plaid is the costume of the Gaeltacht, but similar to wearing just a big blanket like the plaid, it was something that was worn all over the continent, effectively, of Europe, right? Like any fishing village in Great Britain or Ireland, certainly you'd see women wearing a gown and a bedgown and a shawl and doing work like that, and a pair of wooden soled clogs a lot of the time as well. So this wasn't specifically Welsh until you get outsiders coming in from a central location, from London or from Manchester or from somewhere more genteel, and seeing it everywhere and ascribing this look to Welsh quaint forms of dress. Like, I think it's the big hat that does it. The big top hat, the big stovepipe hat, kind of is anachronistic in women's wear by the 19th century in high fashion terms. Like, by the 1810s, certainly the 1820s. Like, Victoria, I think, wears one a little bit every now and then if she's riding, but you don't see women in top hats, really. I don't know why it stuck around as much as it did, but I suspect that a lot of it is because you see it in those trinkets, and those kinds of trinket are being made by the 1830s, 1840s. You see picture postcards with a Welsh lady written on it, and it's just some lady, like, it's like trying to get on with her knitting, like, what? There's somebody gutting a herring, like, what? But she's got the hat on and she's got all the stuff on. And so as that becomes monetizable, and as it becomes, popular in the 19th century to go to rougher parts of the island, so Victorians start going to the Highlands, they start going to the Cairngorms, they start going to Eryri and climbing Yr Wyddfa, it becomes a really big, popular, iconic image of Cymru, and a lot of these women have the clothes, like they have their mum's clothes or they have their grandmother's clothes. And if it earns you a couple of shillings a week to dress in those clothes and be painted, or later on have a photo taken, then sure, of course I'll dress up in my grandma's Sunday clothes if you'll pay me. Like, yeah, give me 20 minutes. It's parallel to the way that the kilt and the tartan have become icons of Scotland, but it is in a similar kind of, well, this is kind of traditional, it's kind of cultural, so we'll monetize it. There are articles of it that are genuinely worn in idiosyncratically Welsh ways throughout the century. Throughout the 19th century, you see women wearing the shawl, the long shawl, often a paisley shawl, especially for going to chapel and that sort of thing. You do see Welsh women wearing those kind of, I don't know what they're called, but like a ruff / cap, with those caps that does that cool thing. You do see, especially more conservative communities, so sort of non-conformist communities, chapel communities rather than church communities, where the Church of England is of course the state religion. Non-conformist chapel communities tend to be sort of the more conservative and more conservatively dressed communities right into the 20th century. So you do see people unironically wearing items of this dress as their Sunday best, and it then becomes that kind of anachronism is formality that you see in things like court dress. So British court dress, let's call it, London court dress, is breeches and a tailcoat for men in the 1790s style until the 1940s. We've got pictures of Laurence Olivier wearing silk breeches and a tailcoat in the 1940s, smoking a cigarette, like going to see the Queen, going to see the King at that point, like, oh, this is how one dresses when one visits the King. Okay, but you look like a tool. So, but yeah, we have that kind of anachronism in costume denotes conservatism and formality aspect, but also there's the monetization of Celtic cultures at the end of the 1800s with the Celtic Revival. So it's all combining, it's all there. But it is the Welsh lady costume. Like, nobody gives a damn what Welshmen are wearing. Like, Welshmen should be down a mine. Like, Welsh ladies, of course, should be at home looking quaint and spinning and knitting. And the Welsh man should be either fighting for very little credit in a British war or down a mine. Men's costume completely falls by the wayside in the 1800s, where, of course, it's mentioned specifically in the 1700s, which is kind of interesting, I think. I'm not sure why, but I suspect that it is that ascribing quaintness and beauty to women that you get a lot in the 1800s, because the Victorians sucked.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because in reality, Welsh women were also on the mines and fishing and gutting fish on the shore. That's like one of the biggest misconceptions about history that drives me just up the wall a bit. To think that women didn't work historically, that's such a misconception about the realities, especially women in poorer communities. They were working as hard, if not harder than the men. because they were often also involved in child rearing and having to take care of homes on top of working at the mine all day.
Anybody who's ever lived or worked on a farm doesn't think that women don't work. Like, everybody gets up at 4 a.m. Everybody does work. Like,
Yeah.
if there's a storm, everybody picks up a hammer and starts replacing bits of buildings. Like, that very human way that we take idealized perceptions or, idealized depictions and just take them as gospel. Which I think is because people innately trust, which is nice, but also you can't do that if you're studying history. Like, you have to question everything. I think it's from Amgueddfa Cymru, from the National Museum. They've got some wonderful, wonderful watercolour sketches that have got depictions of working Welsh women and men in the 18th and 19th century, and they're beautiful and really nicely detailed. The thing that you notice a lot is quite ragged costumes. So people are wearing things, but country ministers even are wearing clothes that have been patched and that could do with, it could do with a brush, maybe. There is this interesting kind of, Wales is so quaint and beautiful, and the people are so interesting, and they speak their funny little language, but like, it's hard. It's a tough old time. It's heavy industry is being developed all over the country. Urbanization is happening, and people are not ready for it, and it's really damaging a lot of the cultural stuff. So, like, coming into the 1900s, throughout that century, the Welsh language is really taking a beating. Like, Welsh culture is taking a hell of a pounding because, as much as anything, 2 world wars, and you do not have any requirement to learn the language at school till 1990. So the year I was born was the year that you had to start learning Welsh in school. And I think it's because they realised I was coming, and I am some kind of cultural second coming. So, seems that way to me.
That's a good one. You're very fortunate to have been born in 1990, that it just so coincidentally happened to line up with the year that they mandated Welsh learning in the schools.
Yeah, but it's fascinating. But yeah, prior to that, there was no requirement to learn our language. You didn't have to learn our language. You had to learn English, of course, in school. Had to do English, and in many places you had to do a foreign language, but you didn't have to learn our language. Of course, it becomes seen as this weird thing, this backward thing. I know that there's this. We're going up to 1920 rather than any later than that, but sort of throughout the 20th century, Welsh national costume is kind of an embarrassment. It's kind of we don't actually wear that. We don't actually dress like that. Nobody actually does that. Nobody really speaks Welsh very much. We're all very, we all want to aspire to live in London or Bath and be genteel British citizens, and that kind of thing. 1900 to 1920, Welsh fashion is, for all intents and purposes, is working class fashion. Men are wearing cloth caps, waistcoats, and shirts and jackets, and going down mines and going into quarries and that sort of thing. And women are wearing working class women's clothing from the period. So, the corset and the skirt and the shirt waist, and that's kind of what you see. So it's kind of an interesting, like, full flip back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Wales has this really distinct way of dressing that people are very proud of, that is monetized, that becomes this kind of identifiable aspect of culture. And then by the 1900s and the 20th century, people are very much like, okay, we need to go back to work. Okay, that was fun, and now back to work. You still see it, like, you still see postcards, Welsh lady pictures everywhere. There's a lot of it in the sort of tourist side of Wales. Wales as a kind of industrial nation drops a little bit of that quaint tourist side of its personality until kind of after World War One and after World War Two in many places. But you still see it in, like I say, in the postcards, in the souvenirs, in the trinkets that are made everywhere. Those brass, like the weird little brass bells where the lady's skirt is the bell. Like, we've all got them. I've got one over there. The aspect that sticks, interestingly, is the shawl. The use of shawls continues in Wales as a way of holding children, a way of supporting children. That is something that is kept. You see men and women using the shawl fagu, the raising, the rearing shawl. And we've got wonderful stories and pictures of working class Welsh men walking down the street in the 1910s and 20s with cloth cap and a waistcoat. Like, fresh out of the quarry, blackened face, with a paisley shawl with a baby, walking to the pub. And in a lot of places, these are shawls that have been in use for potentially up to a century. Like, these are Victorian style shawl that goes over the kerchief and goes over the shoulders when you're wearing your traditional gown, your tea gown, your bed gown. They're in use up to the 1950s, 1960s, 70s in some places. So in a way, drag becomes part of men's traditional Welsh costume in the 20th century, because they're all wearing their wives' and mothers' shawls to take their kid to the pub with them. In terms of the 20th century fashion and sort of more globalized, or certainly westernized fashion is the norm, but the little shawl idiosyncrasy stays, and I'm trying to bring it back. So every now and then my godchildren have been carried in shawls here and there if I've had any influence. But yeah, generally the 20th century is kind of where folk costume as daily wear is no longer really a thing in Cymru.
What were the primary fibers and materials being used during these periods for clothing production? Is it mostly wool and linen, or are they getting other fibers as well? Because cotton is pretty expensive up until like the mid 1700s, early 1800s, at least in Britain. So, what's going on with Welsh fashion? Are they still also struggling to afford cotton due to being a lot lower income?
Yeah, nailed. Yeah, basically. It's interesting to talk about cotton becoming less expensive in the 1700s, because of course it is, but it's becoming less expensive if you can get hold of it, right? So it's less expensive if you're say living in London, or you're living in Manchester or Birmingham, which are large centres of trade and exchange. But Wales, even today, we don't have a city that compares to the English cities. Even Cardiff is tiny by comparison to, a Manchester or a Glasgow. So wool is the fibre that's being used throughout the period that we've talked about, like for 500 years. My grandparents wore woolen underwear. My grandfather would go out into the field wearing a wool flannel shirt, and it's just wool. Like, it's just wool. I mean, today we have 3 million people in Wales. We have 9 million sheep. And Wales has been we've been a centre of wool production for a good 200-300 years. It was a lot more of a mixed agrarian economy before that. But yeah, it's wool. And linen is worn. It's like the de rigueur shirt material, of course, shift and shirt material. Kind of by the 16th century, certainly, if you can afford it. I'm not saying everybody was so poor that they had to wear hair shirts. Like, people are wearing linen shirts. By the 19th century, people are wearing cotton shirts. Certainly by the end of the 19th century, your shirt is made of cotton, unless it's a heavy-duty work shirt or it's a military shirt. British soldiers in the Second World War were issued wool shirts. We've got shawls, interestingly, in all of the above. We've got cotton shawls and linen and wool shawls of various weights for decorative or some of them are kerchiefs rather than shawls. You do see the occasional silk shawl as this traditional item, which is obviously a prized possession for anybody. So silk is being used, it's being worn. The Welsh word for silk is sitan, so we do have a word for silk. We know it exists. Higher up the scale, there's a lot more variety, there's a lot more difference in colour. People are dyeing with more exotic dye stuffs. But yeah, the lower order, which is where folk dress tends to come from, red and blue wool is basically they're the big things that you see.
What dye stuffs are being used for the red and blue?
Effectively, madder and woad, or the chemical equivalent as time moves forward and as you start to isolate the indigo from the woad. Madder, woad, and weld are kind of the big Great Britain primary coloured dye powerhouses of the last 2,000 years, before synthetic dyes become the norm. And even then, a lot of the synthetic blue dye is just processed, the indigo tin from woad plants. Lots of madder, lots of woad, bit of weld here and there. It doesn't grow as much in in Wales as it does in England and lowland Scotland. I've heard some sort of folk stories about using crushed shellfish for dyeing, like crushed mussel shell. Where I'm from, in Bangor, we've got a very large mussel beds. We've got Europe's largest mussel beds. I'm not sure how well that works. I haven't actually looked into the use of mussel, kind of the European mussel, but I've heard tell of the use of shellfish as dye stuffs. But take it with a little pinch of salt. More research required, but it's an interesting concept. It's certainly, an abundant local material that I could believe, if it has a purpose in dyeing, would be used for dyeing.
So final question, if people want to learn more about Welsh fashion, where can they find resources?
I would wholeheartedly recommend Amgueddfa Cymru, the Welsh National Museum. Its future is kind of slightly uncertain, which is flabbergasting for a national museum to have an uncertain future, but speaks volumes. Because they have a wonderful collection of paintings, of literary descriptions, and photos of Welsh fashion through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So they're really, really great resource for visual depictions of it. For literary and documentary stuff, I would go to Llyfrgell Genedlaethol Cymru, which is the National Library of Wales, because they've also got some really good digitized resources in terms of the written descriptions of Welsh costume in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's tough to recommend anything earlier than that, because as far as I'm aware, there's not much earlier than that. But those are the two places I would go to start with. And I happen to know that they have very approachable teams in their archives and research departments, and they are very happy to help people who want to research Welsh culture. So the National Museum and the National Library, definitely.
Awesome. Well, diolch, Jimmy. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And yeah, and it's been lovely to hear a bit about Welsh fashion, because of course there's so much more that we could cover today, but we can't, unfortunately.
No, we didn't even mention clogs.
Nope, we didn't even get into clogs. Do you want to talk about clogs really quick?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, clogs are working class footwear for hundreds of cultures and peoples for centuries. But yeah, Wales has adopted it as a cultural item. So now you get clog dancing at the Eisteddfodau as a competitive sport. So if you fancy having a go at that, that's a thing you can do. But yeah, clogs obviously they don't create sparks in the same way that hobnail boots do if you're working around gunpowder in a mine or a quarry. So they were very practical items of footwear. They're easy to repair, and yeah, up to the 1950s they were common working shoes. So yeah, we wear clogs. I say we. I don't own a pair of traditional clogs, but I do intend to make my own pair of clogs in the next couple of years. So.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I really appreciated you sharing your knowledge with all of us.
Thank you. Well, I have a question for you, actually.
Okay.
As a surprise. So obviously, you're exemplary as somebody who embraces their cultural expression through the clothing that you wear and the way that you dress and the way that you express yourself. As a Cymro, as a Welsh person, what do you think my first step should be in terms of trying to express my culture through my dress? Do you think I should start wearing a shawl, or do you think I should do something else? Or I dress kind of old-fashioned as it is, but what do you think my first step? How can I be more like you?
I think the first thing you should do is put a leek leaf in your hat.
One day a year.
No, but I think you should make it an all the time thing, as in you should just be known as the guy that wears the leek leaf in your hat.
Ooh.
Because the leek is such an important symbol of Wales, as you know, and so I think that could be a really beautiful way, because people might get it a lot more than if you wear a shawl.
Ooh, that's really cool. And that's like starting a new tradition as well.
Exactly.
That's great. Okay, when I don't have leeks or they're not in season, I guess I'll use a green and white patch of cloth or something.
You could maybe even somehow preserve it with epoxy or something and create an epoxy leaf that could then be almost like a brooch that you could put into your hat.
I love that. That's so good. You know what? Yeah, okay. I actually have a leek in my fridge right now. I'm going to go and take a leaf off it and give it a wash and pin it to my cap when I go out today. That's the thing. I'm going to do that. Thank you.
I think that's a great idea. And of course, you know the language, that's already a huge step, and yeah. And you can always wear shawls too, that's always an option. But the leek leaf is just so cool. That's something that really has stuck with me since you've said it. So I think that's beautiful.
Awesome. I'm going to do that. I'm going to unironically go and do that.